Looking back at my life before 50, there are some financial decisions that I made then that I would absolutely change. Not because anything went particularly wrong, but because I hadn't fully thought through the impact that the decisions that I made then would have on the freedom and the lifestyle that I would have later. And I think this is quite common. You follow the path that you expect to take. You buy the house, you work hard, you build security. And on the surface, that makes perfect sense. But when you reach your 40s, you start to think things through a little differently. You start thinking less about the accumulation of things, and you start to think about the life that you actually want in the future. One of the biggest mistakes that I made was thinking about my house as my security and focusing all of my attention on paying off the mortgage because I believed that being mortgage free meant freedom. What I didn't fully appreciate was that in paying off the mortgage, what I was actually doing was tying up my finances into that property. And so I was asset rich, but cash poor. And that meant less flexibility and less financial freedom. What I'd do instead is I'd think earlier about flexibility, especially when it came to the finances. I'd think about how I could use my property in order to give myself more financial flexibility and freedom. For a long time, I didn't really consider my expenses and how I was spending money. I enjoyed the fact that I could be comfortable about my spending habits and not really have to think about every pound and every penny. But thinking about the future and retirement, if I could go back now, I'd think about how my life was simply expanding into the bigger house, the more outgoings, the more commitments. And because it happened gradually, I didn't really take a lot of notice. So what I would do differently is I would think about what I was spending. I would define what was enough for us to live a certain lifestyle much earlier. When you understand what your life actually costs you, you gain control much, much sooner. The third thing I did was I spent years focusing on following a traditional work structure. I didn't really question how I was earning my income. And that kept me stuck in the 9 to 5, and it was much longer hours than 9 to 5, to be honest. And it actually put an awful lot of pressure on maintaining that working structure and that particular job. And so what I would do now differently now is I would think about how I could earn income differently and the flexibility that that would afford me in not just focusing on that 9 to 5 lifestyle, and think about, what are there different work streams I could do? Could I work part-time? Could I have a couple of jobs where one afforded me some predictability, and yet I had another work stream that would allow me flexibility and a bit more joy, actually, and that would pave the way for my future working structure. This is probably the biggest one. I waited longer than I needed before thinking about changes I could make. It wasn't because I couldn't make the changes. It was just because everything felt fine. It was fine enough. It was all okay. And so I just really went through the motions on autopilot without actually thinking about how I could do things differently. So what I'd do differently is I'd act much sooner on that feeling that something isn't quite right. Because when you're in your 40s, you actually have a lot longer in front of you than you really consider. You have a good 30 or 40 years in most cases of life ahead of you. So in fact, you're typically only halfway through. And if you think about 20 of those could still be working. So it's worth thinking about what that work looks like for you. The other mistake I made was really thinking very black and white. You either had this or you had that. And I didn't really consider that space in the middle where you could do things differently to suit the life that you want for the future. What that did was it kept me stuck in the middle, because I would think everything has to change or nothing has to change at all, rather than being a bit more fluid and a bit more flexible about how those changes could work for me. I would focus more about gradual redesign of my life. I retrained in my 40s, and what that allowed me to do was follow a path that I felt really passionate about, helping people, giving back, doing something that stimulated me mentally, but also enabled me to bring about change, not just for myself, but for other people. And I did that through retraining as a psychotherapist and a counsellor. And eventually that moved me into life coaching. And that was incredibly rewarding. But what I did was I did that part-time. So I would do my day job, and then in the evenings and at weekends, I would run my practice until I was in the position where I could change. And I stepped away full-time from my working life in marketing, and I moved into having a therapy practice. The other thing that enabled me to do was also do a little bit of marketing consultancy work. So I didn't lose the experience and the skills that I had built in 25 years worth of marketing. I was able to be very flexible and fluid about how I earned my income during my 40s and 50s. One of the other things that I looked at when I made that sort of gradual redesign was thinking about the location in which I lived. We didn't actually downsize our family home, we actually upsized, but what we did do was move location to enable that to happen. And that gave us more financial stability and put us in a good position where we had some investment that we could then that we could then use into retirement. None of the mistakes that I've talked about were particularly dramatic or fundamental. They were perfectly normal, but collectively they sort of built a situation where they delayed my freedom. And the good news is that none of this is fixed. Once you start looking at your life differently, it enables you to make different choices, and it opens up options for you. They don't have to be really big choices. They just need to be really intentional, and therefore looking at where you are now in your circumstances, questioning whether you're making any of these financial mistakes, mean that you can start to build a future and the freedom that you want as you look forward. And so if you're thinking about how you're going to create a life that is different, that gives you more flexibility and more freedom, consider subscribing, because that is exactly the conversation that I have on this channel, where I talk about my own experiences, the way that I'm starting to think differently, so that I can have the life that I want for the next 20, 30, 40 years. I'm Angela. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again.